Hey everyone, and happy Labor Day weekend. This Labor Day weekend, I'm going to talk to you about world building. What is world building? We're going to cover that. We're also going to talk about, um, where it takes place, how those things are done, and how to do it. I decided to do this video because world building is something that is a weakness for me. I'm not very verbose when I talk, and I'm also not very verbose when I write. So I wanted to say, hey, if this is a weakness for you, like I know that it's a weakness for me, let's do a video. Let's look into some background information on it, and maybe help other new aspiring authors like myself that are out there. So, what does the world building do? It defines the scope. It is the full world. It's a single city, or is it a small village? Where is your story going to take place, and how do you convey that to the reader? For me, it was single state, in this first novel that I'm on my second draft of. And it also takes place in an area that I'm very familiar with. But as I've tried to look at that area more objectively instead of subjectively, I have found that there's things about it that I didn't even recognize were there. So even though it's an area I'm familiar with, it's something that is, you know, um, just kind of out there, and that I wasn't, that I didn't have all the intricacies. So writing about them, I'm finding that I'm having to go back and research that area a little bit more to add a little bit more to my book. Um, there's also, people who are building completely new worlds, Lord of the Rings, in Middle Earth, with Tolkien, and, Harry Potter, is embedded within the modern day UK, but it's still a world of its own. So, staying in the real world, um, I think is a little bit easier than creating a world from scratch. But if you're writing fantasy, I can see that, you're going to have to think about all those little details and that are out there. For me, there's going to be a lot of research in the future because one of my books is a historical novel taking place in medieval times. I don't know that much about medieval France. I do know a little bit more about medieval England, so that part of the book will be a little bit easier. But as far as medieval, not a clue. So there's going to be some research that I'm going to have to do. And your genre and your tone are going to influence that as well. One of the things that I found is when you're writing fantasy and sci-fi and, you know, those kinds of things, are they dark? Are they gritty? Are they light? Are they whimsical? Are they a bright world where you have to describe a lot of colors, or is it outdoors, in the woods, but it's an enchanted woods? Um, so what kinds of things are there? Is it going to be like the Wizard of Oz, where you have to build a whole new area with its own culture and its own religions, and um, how society manifested in those areas? Um, for me, it's going to be fantasy, and religion is going to take a big part of that. Um, Especially Catholicism. I'm not Catholic, so that's going to take a little bit more research as well. Then you also need to establish the rules of the reality. Is there magic or is there technology? For me in my book, in my current book, there are cell phones. There is modern technology because it's contemporary. It's taking place now. Whereas, when I write the book on medieval times, that technology is not going to exist. There's not going to be a magical world. It's going to be a very difficult thing to write about, from that perspective. um, what are the limits? What are the consequences of this reality? Where are those borders? And does time flow differently? Do people live longer? With the medieval book that I'm writing, people don't live past their 30s and 40s for the most part. Those are very old people. The fourth step is designing a physical world. You know, are you creating a whole new Earth? Are you creating a new dystopian society, on a foreign planet? So what kind of climate and ecosystems live there, and what kind of creatures are there? Are there insects that could play a role? Um, You know, in Harry Potter, there's the Bezoar that, you know, pretty much can bring people back from the brink of death. We see that um, in Half-Blood Prince when Ron almost dies. So, you know, one of the things that I found is map it out if that helps, you know, completely do that first. Think about your geography and culture and trade and what conflicts take place in those areas. So those are things to figure out and map out before you start writing and creating this world. Like I said, in my current novel, I know the area, but I didn't truly know the area, you know, as I've started taking more and more train rides through that area. I've noticed more and more things. I've noticed how the sun rises over the mountains, how that changes the shadows, how that changes the area, the look. I've noticed that there's some more old adobe structures, like original adobe mud and brick style, you know, mud and straw style, but bricks used in some of the older buildings that are a little more dilapidated. So I'm going to need to map out some of those things when I'm describing my character's train ride. Um, and as you create this new world, what are the different species? Are there multiple races of humans? Are there multiple species of humans? You know, as you see in like Star Trek: The Next Generation or Star Trek, where there's humanoid creatures, but they look very different. Um, so, what kind of culture and laws govern these various societies and civilizations? For me, again, my first book is very contemporary, so you know, modern laws, those things are going to be a little bit easier to write about. But however, you know, moving forward with the other novels that I'm working on, those things are going to be a little bit more difficult. One of my books is going to take place during World War One, so there is a little bit of technology, but it's warlike technology. So I'm going to have to worry about that. I'm going to have to worry about how my characters move around. You know, it was Greyhound bus back then, or not really buses back then, but trains, hitchhiking, things like that. So I'm going to have to build a very different world for that particular novel. So step five is creating cultures and societies. You know, are you talking about a kingdom or empires or democracies? Um, like I said, first book is contemporary, but my next book is very, you know, there's kingdoms and there's empires that exist. There's the Holy Roman Empire that still exists. There's still the Austrian-Hungarian Empire that exists, that stretches across northern France into some of the Germanic states. So those are things I'm going to have to research and create to see what those cultures were, to see what that medieval culture was, um, and how that influences, you know, the politics within the kingdom, the rich religion and belief systems within the kingdom. That because in my second book, this is also about the time of the Reformation starting. So and also the split of the church in England. So those are going to be some things that, yes, I'm going to be writing about these characters, but I'm also going to need that information as part of building my world. You know, when you're also creating the culture and society, what kind of economy? You know, what class systems exist? You know, for me, writing about the medieval times, that's going to be something that, you know, there's very much a class society there. Um, and what kind of currency, depending on the kingdom you were in, you know, or the empire. So things to think about there. And like I said, with technology, or you know, who knows, maybe you create your own technology, you know, using Star Trek again as an example, you know, the whole being able to use the teleporter and you know, transport people here and there between planets and the spacecraft and things like that. So keeping an eye on that, creating cultures and societies, I think in some ways, maybe a fantasy is in my future, a fantasy book, and just being able to create those things from scratch sounds really exciting. But for what I have in progress right now, that's mainly I'm sticking to whatever was contemporary at the time. Step six is language and naming conventions. This was another thing I found online. I'm creating consistent naming styles for people. So if you're in France, as I will be, you know, I'm going to have to use French names and talk about places. But if I'm creating a whole new world, what if people from one society all have a different language, all talk in a different way? Maybe the people there, all their first names are only 5 letters long or 4 letters long, and making sure that stays consistent throughout. For my current book, it's English and Hispanic names, and making sure I stay within those cultures and those traditions, especially, the number of Hispanic or that Latinx, I believe is now the common term, folks that are here in New Mexico, and being able to stay within those names and use actual names of people that, I have heard of or maybe not heard of, and have to look up some, make sure I'm getting the spellings right, things like that. One of the more confusing names here I'll stay away from is Gonzalez, because it can be spelled about 3 or 4 different ways. So, um, and also, as we saw in Black Panther, there were languages that had to be created amongst some of the societies there in that movie. So there, again, that's part of that language and naming conventions, and making sure that when you're writing, you're staying consistent throughout. Step 7, is other things to look at, is like history and lore. Are you going to create major events that shaped the world that you're building, or do you stay within, contemporary times? For me, it's wars and disasters and things like that in my initial book, but in the second book, it's going to be the Reformation. It's going to be um, starting that change of thought from, Catholicism and the Pope running everything in the world, to kings starting to revolt back. And then, we have the creation of the Church of England, um, so that Anne Boleyn can marry Henry VIII. So there's going to be other things, some historical events that are going to have to be incorporated if you're writing from a historical perspective. But if you're creating a whole new world, like I said, that sounds like something that's very fun and creative that you can do. Is, hey, there was a war that maybe we talk about it on the side, but that's influences, the thought processes um, that you're experiencing now. And then what's everyday life like? What do people eat? What do they wear? What do they celebrate? You can create your own holidays for the people in this area. I'm sorry for that interruption. So, what do people eat? What do they wear? What holidays are they celebrating? Maybe they have a holiday like Christmas, but it's not really Christmas. How do they travel? Like I said, one of mine's going to take place during the time of World War One. So traveling will be train, bus, or, hitchhiking, walking, carriage rides, things like that. What do children learn? Do they go to school? What are the cultural taboos? You're not supposed to look at somebody more than 3 seconds, or you're putting a curse on them, things like that. Taking all of that into account. Um, the ninth thing to take into consideration is make it serve the story. One of the things that I came across on a couple things was just don't overbuild. Don't spend 2 chapters building the world. Um, and it's not really relevant to your plot or to your characters. Make sure that whatever, as you're building your world, have it take part as part of the protagonist's journey. How does it get them from A to B? How does, you can describe their trip between, for me, there's going to be a trip between um, Germany and Paris. So how do I describe that? And that's how I'll build the world in the book that takes place in medieval times during the Holy Roman Empire. Maybe I'll have them walk on ancient stone roads that were built by the Romans, and water serves the town from aqueducts that have been there, which is true. There's still towns in France that get their water from aqueducts built by the Romans. So, those will be things that I'll have to build in when I'm talking about, we stop for water. But I don't have to spend, a whole chapter talking about the Roman roads and aqueducts and things like that. I just build it in and weave it in as part of the overall story. And that was the 10th thing that I came across, was just weave the details into the dialogue, the setting, and maybe the characters' actions. If they're in a mountainous area, they're running up the mountain path and it's rocky and it causes them to stumble. It wears them out. It makes them more tired, more fatigued because of the bag that they're carrying with their possessions. However you decide to build that in. And then again, the last thing was don't dump a lot of information onto the reader. Just let them discover it through how you weave it into the story, how you weave it into dialogues, how you weave it into the setting of a particular chapter. Um, some bonus tips that I was given was, build out what you need and expand. So if you're writing a 3 or 4 book um, series, then start out small. This is where book one takes place, and then this is how it builds on book one into book two, and then on to three, or maybe chapter one to two to three, and expand it slowly. And the last piece of advice that I was given and that I've read online is, make it a real world culture. You can make something very similar to Greece and Athenians and Spartans, or, something very similar to the Holy Roman Empire. And then build out from there how you want this world to look. For me, it's Middle Ages and medieval times. So I know it's going to be dirt roads, gravel roads, um, mainly a lot of farmers, a lot of, people migrating into bigger cities as they become hungry during this time, um, things like that. So being able to build on a real world, I think is going to be an advantage to me. But like I said, overall, the reason I kind of gave you this today is this is, this is a weakness of mine. It's something that, like I said, I'm not a person who originally was into a lot of detail until I started working on my book and being, got feedback from the editor, who was my mother-in-law, um, who has a couple books published, that these are things that I need to do, and this is definitely a weakness she saw throughout my book. So this is something that like I said, I want to pass it on, to help new writers out there avoid some of the struggles that I'm currently having to go back and include some detail and do a little more world building throughout my novel. So I hope this was helpful to some of you. Have a great evening. Have a great holiday weekend. Um, Again, like and subscribe if you want more content, and have a great day.